Drones have evolved a lot over the years. They've gotten way better, and hopefully our photo and video skills can evolve with them. So when DJI reached out to sponsor a video talking about my Mavic 3 workflow, I got really excited because this is still the best consumer drone on the market, and it just got a massive firmware upgrade that totally updates its photo and video capabilities. So let's talk about the tips and tricks you're gonna need to get the most out of the Mavic 3. I'm gonna start off talking about filmmaking, but if you want to jump straight to photography, I'll put some timestamps down below. All right, here's a hot tip. On a sunny day, bring a towel, or if you've got a jacket or whatever you can cover yourself up with, because what happens is that the phones often overheat, both from running for a long time and just having the screen at full brightness. The screen starts to dim way down, like very difficult to see in the sun. So you could get a professional hood, or you could just, do what I'm doing. And to help me talk about it, I'm gonna bring in a new camera in the studio, my B cam, the Mavic 3. I've just rigged it up on a C-stand here so you can see the results of the changes as I talk about them. By the way, huge tip, when you're going through and making these changes, do it before you take off so you're not wasting battery life while you're in the air and you're ready to shoot as soon as the drone gets up there. Right now, we're using completely automatic settings, which work great a lot of the time, but the reason you want to lock them into something manual is so they don't change in the middle of a shot. Otherwise, afterwards, you've got to fix it in post with grading, and there's just no reason to struggle through that. So let's set things up. So first, I'll tap the auto button in the bottom right. We're going to switch over to Pro mode. And this is already doing a lot of automatic settings. It's already focused on me pretty well, but when you're in the air, you don't want it refocusing while you're flying. So what I usually do is actually set it to the maximum focus distance and just lock it there, because the last thing you want is that it suddenly tries to jump forward right in the middle of something great. Usually it's fine, but now you don't have to worry about it. So in this case, it's actually the opposite. I want it to focus as close as possible because, well, camera's right in front of me. Then we're going to switch the exposure out of auto into pro mode. And right now it actually looks pretty good because, it's good at this exposure thing. So what we can do if you want to quickly get some good settings is have the auto settings on and then just turn them off. And that'll give you a baseline to start at. Generally, you're trying to keep the ISO as low as possible. As with all video cameras, your shutter speed should generally be about twice what your frame rate is. So right now I'm shooting at 24 frames per second. So that means I want to try to be around 1/50th of a second. Now my studio is pretty well lit, but it's not as bright as outside when you're flying this drone. And usually what I'm doing is adding an ND filter. Now to choose the ND that you're going to add, which these come in the Fly More kit, you get a whole bunch of options. I often go with ND 16 because it's kind of in the middle. Like a huge advantage that you have with the Mavic 3 is that you have a variable aperture. So if I set this somewhere in the middle and that's what it looks correct in when I'm shooting outside, I have some room to raise or lower the exposure with the aperture when I want to shoot photos. Then I can have a faster or slower shutter speed, or if I switch to slow motion, it's not too dark for a stronger ND. So ND 16, I kind of find that to be the sweet spot. Real quick, let me show you how to change the ND filter because it wasn't totally obvious to me the first time. You just twist it a little bit and it snaps off. Line up the circles and it snaps back on. Some of the biggest improvements in the Mavic 3 firmware update are to the zoom lens. So now we have manual controls, which are extremely welcome. I have a feeling it's gonna be a little harder to show off in the studio. Yep, that's a little tight, but I could still lower the exposure. There we go. The Mavic 3 has the best wide-angle lens that I've seen on a consumer drone, but one thing that makes it really special is that it also has a 7x telephoto lens. Now, that doesn't just help you get closer, it also dramatically changes the perspective as the camera moves around the subject. If you've watched any action movie, you've seen this in effect. Basically, the parallax, the difference between objects close and far from the lens, change really quickly as it moves with this big zoomed-in lens. Now, one thing you have to know is that it is a different sensor. This is a 1/2" sensor instead of the Micro Four Thirds of the wide angle, so the quality is not going to be the same. Probably the most important thing to remember is that this sensor wants a lot of light, so you're going to be wanting to shoot in complete daylight. If you've put an ND filter on it, you probably don't want to use the strongest one because it's going to cut a lot of that down. So the big sensor might need a stronger ND than the small sensor. But one more key thing to remember, this actually isn't a zoom lens. It's two lenses, a wide angle and a telephoto. And so if you're at anything other than 1x or 7x, it's not actually using true optical zoom. It's just digital zoom, which isn't really zoom, it's kind of cropping. So when I'm using it, I just switch back and forth between 1 and 7. For some more creative ideas how to do this, Josh Yeo did a really great breakdown on how to move through a scene and get some cool shots with it. And the update also adds RAW support in photo mode, which is great because it makes it a lot easier to match photos between the wide and the zoom lens. Another decision you're going to have to make is if you want to shoot in normal or log profile. And I actually find this a little harder to make that decision on the Mavic 3 because normal looks really good. That's what we're looking at right now. Often I choose to shoot in D-Log. They made this even flatter on the Mavic 3, so it means you get more dynamic range, but you also do have to spend a little more time grading it in post. It does require adding LUTs and usually some manual grading, but there's way more flexibility, so it's really up to you, but it does take a little bit of extra time to use D-Log. A great feature added to the firmware upgrade is now we have a much better color display assist that just is more contrasty and gives you a better, more accurate idea of what your image is going to look like. Now, I just realized I also didn't turn off the auto white balance. That one's super important too. You can do the same thing where you set it with auto, but don't let it change while you're shooting. And also notice that when you shoot in D-Log, you're forced to go up to ISO 400, so it's going to be a little bit brighter. Just be aware of that while you're making your exposure decisions. And one more time, here's what D-Log looks like, and I'll bring in an extra light so you can see what overexposed areas look like. And here's that same shot in the normal profile. Once you've got the settings dialed in, the image from this Micro Four Thirds Hasselblad sensor looks amazing. It's the right balance of sharpness. The colors are very natural. Lots of flexibility to grade. You've got professional image quality up in the air. If you're running short on time, but you want some great coverage of the location you're in, check out the master shot option. The Mavic 3 has built-in APOS 5.0, which is basically just intelligent obstacle avoidance, and it's going to know how to fly around on its own and get a variety of shots that all look really cool. You just tell it what you want it to focus on, and it's going to circle around it and fly by it and fly up and down and, you know, all the stuff that you might do manually, but it's going to do it without any of the jerkiness that a human pilot might sometimes have. Even if you're an advanced user, I do recommend you dig into some of those menus to check out some of the automated shots, because you can just get so much more from the location than if you're trying to fly everything manually. And some of the shots might actually be impossible to shoot otherwise, like Active Track, which does a great job of locking onto any subject. And now in version 5.0, it's gotten smarter about obstacle avoidance, and it's using the latest APAS 5.0. Or for really tricky shots, you can use Spotlight mode so that you can still fly manually and stay locked onto your subject. And don't forget slow motion frame rates. They can work wonders. I mean, turning it to 48 frames per second, 5.1K can let you capture just some incredible scenery. And the nice thing about slow motion is you always come back with twice as much footage as the time you spent shooting it, which is especially important when you've traveled somewhere amazing. In the new firmware, these settings have gotten even crazier, where at 1080p, you can shoot up to 200 frames per second. And now let's spend some time talking about photography. Often when you're up in the air, you're jumping back and forth between photos and videos during the same flight, because you can't dedicate one flight to each or the other, you're gonna miss stuff. So the Mavic will remember your settings in both. As you press the little flip camera button on your controller, it will remember the last thing you were doing in video or the last thing you were doing in photo, so that you don't have to reset everything. And I'd say common differences in those settings is that in photo, you might be shooting at a lower ISO because D-Log sets you at 400, and you're gonna try to have a faster shutter speed just to make sure everything's sharp. Whenever I'm shooting drone photos, I'm trying to get good vertical options too. So I'll start off by just taking my standard wide image, and you can use those rule of thirds lines to get a sense of like what's in the middle and line it all up so it kind of fits near those two lines. And that's kind of what your vertical is going to look like. But I usually go one step further, and I'll shoot at least 2 or 3 photos panning up and down so that I get a good vertical panorama stitch that I'll do later in post. Shooting these panoramas, you're going to have a much easier time if you shoot them in manual mode, so the exposure and the white balance completely matches between any photos that are going to get stitched together. When you're shooting photos, a lot of the DJI drones offer RAW or JPEG shooting options, and I always choose RAW as often as possible because you've gone to all the work of traveling to beautiful Portugal. You want the photos to turn out, and once it's up in the air, you don't necessarily know for sure if you've clipped some highlights or you've got your white balance wrong until you get back to the computer. And with RAW, you have the full ability to make those adjustments in post. If you've set your exposure correctly, then there's not really a big quality difference between RAW and JPEG. It's mostly about the flexibility. There can be a bit of a trade-off when you're shooting RAW, because when it's writing the files to the micro SD card, it can take a little bit longer. But that's why you get a fast one. Do not use slow SD cards in here, especially if you're going to be shooting 4K. But overall, there's not a big quality difference between RAW and JPEG. If you get your settings right, JPEG will be just fine. RAW is all about the flexibility in post. If you're unsure about your exposure while the drone is in the air, I'd recommend in daylight underexposing a little bit, because remember, we're shooting at the lowest ISO possible, and it's easier to recover the detail in the shadows than in overexposed highlights. When you're setting your exposure, it can be hard to judge how bright it should be, especially when your phone starts to dim on a hot day like this. So I always turn on my histogram and I keep an eye on them. Basically, I'm just trying to keep everything in the middle. Hopefully not much or nothing, preferably, is clipping in the highlights or the shadows. It's just a more reliable way to know that your image is going to turn out. By the way, when DJI dropped their new firmware, they did add a brand new LUT that offers a more vivid look, and that's what I'm going to use by default on every video because it's got more contrast in the same way that I would be adding it myself. Now, the Mavic 3 has this big zoom lens on it, so I'm going to zoom in 7 times and try something I couldn't really do with my previous drones. That's stitching together a whole bunch of telephoto images to create a panorama that has lens compression. Now, I kind of approach this by finding the general shot I want with the wide lens and then just back up and keep backing up really far, because 7 times is a lot of zoom. Getting all these files back to the computer, I was very happily surprised that they stitched together and it totally worked, because I was just experimenting and it turned out great. So this is everything you get in the Fly More kit, obviously. The drone. It also comes with a whole bunch of extra propellers in case you ever break these. These are probably the only thing that'll ever break on it. 3 batteries, as well as a charging dock for all 3 of them at once. And it uses USB-C, which I love. The controller, which has basically become standard amongst all of the DJI drones. You kind of get used to using one and they're all the same. A set of ND filters, each of them cover each lens on the camera. A little bird muzzle thing for when you close up the drone. It kind of looks like what they put on the front of hunting falcons. And a DJI bag to put it all inside that also converts to a backpack, so you can also fit a regular camera or anything else in your bag. So this is the batteries look like on the Mavic 3. You can always press the button here to check the charge on them. They're rated to last about 46 minutes, but you know, you can never completely be sure of that, so always assume the worst. Assume they're not going to last as long as they're supposed to, and you'll have a good flight. Because remember, you still got to get home with some battery left. The DJI controllers have always been awesome on battery, so you kind of never need to recharge it. This will go for weeks at a time. Hopefully you feel more confident in your photo and video settings now. And next, watch my video about how to choose between Final Cut Pro and Premiere Pro for your video editing. I'll see you in the next video, guys.